Doug, what attracted you to studying theology?
Well, I was born and raised in Memphis. My father was killed by a drunk driver when I was 5, and I had two brothers and a sister younger than I. So my mother never remarried. A great aunt came to live with us. So we lived not in poverty. No, I never felt that, but I felt always that we were a bit precarious. So two institutions were vitally important for our family, the church and public schools. So in many ways, my whole life has been an expression of gratitude for the church and for the schools that got us through those times. Um, my first call was to, I thought, pastoral ministry. But by the time I was in college, I had the sense that what I really wanted to do was teaching and research. Um, what drove me, I think, from an early age was that I lived in a culture between William Faulkner's Mississippi Delta and Mark Twain's Hannibal. So I'm a product of Mississippi River culture, or what a new book just published has called the Beale Street Empire. So Memphis, in many ways, had a great history, though it was deeply wounded by failed Reconstruction, by the yellow fever epidemic, and by what I saw at a very early age, racism and deep poverty. So these were issues that affected me while I was still a teenager, and they're still the issues that drive me most. So by the time I was a sophomore in college, I had a pretty handsome doubt. And Paul Tillich uh, helped me get through that, especially his sermons. So I was attracted to theology first by Tillich. As I moved on in college, I was a double major of English and philosophy. I became deeply attracted by Whitehead's philosophy and became a process theologian for a while, a rather rabid one. I wrote a lot of papers on that. And it was not until I got into divinity school at Duke that I began to see other possibilities. And not really until I spent a couple of years in Germany did I move more to the Reformed tradition. But I've never given up these first concerns, poverty and racism. And I think what attracted me to theology was the theodicy question. How could there be so much injustice if God is powerful and if God has promised freedom and justice for God's people?
How has theological education changed over the years?
Well, I've been at it a long time. I began theological education on the faculty at Eden Seminary in St. Louis. This is the seminary of the Niebuhr brothers, and it has an old tradition stemming from the Protestant church that Schleiermacher began in 1817. When I came to Eden, this was 1971, just the year before that, Eden had established a development department. It never had a development department because at the end of the year, it simply sent its bill to the church, and the church paid the bill. And in fact, this really blew my mind. For a long time, the faculty made the assignments of students to their first pastorates. So I would think that the biggest change in my time of teaching is the business plan. That is, how to keep theological education alive financially. And that's still our struggle. It's still the open question about the future of theological education in the United States. The second big question, I think, went along with that in some ways, and that is trying to identify why we exist. The old Latin question, cui bono, for whose good do we exist anyway? So I think in the 70s, theological education began to lose its original sense of existence, the reason for its existence. And the new business plan said the money was not going to come directly from the church. You had to raise the money. And this partly meant that we became less of a professional school in general, and a school that was accepting and trying to educate people who were not sure about their vocation. So those two things, I believe, are still the questions that haunt us, the questions we're going to have to solve if there's going to be a future of theological education.
What new developments or schools of thought have emerged over the course of your career?
Well, the 1960s was the decade in which American theology changed drastically. And it was more or less around the watershed year of 1968. For me, that's still the year that changed everything. Martin was assassinated on April 4th. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in June. We had the Paris barricades in July, the invasion of Czechoslovakia in August, and then the election of Richard Nixon. And so I don't think we've ever quite recovered from that. In October '68, my wife Blair and I took a 3-month-old child to Germany for 2 years. Fortunately, the student revolt was just beginning in Germany, so it was an exciting time. But around that year, 1968, there were a lot of new theologies. Theology became entrepreneurial in the same way that theological education did. So my white theologians were basically doing methodological theology, asking how we can know God or how we can do theology at all in terms of epistemology. But the movements that attracted me and that shaped my theology were liberation theologies. First of all, Latin American liberation theology, and then black theology in this country, feminist theology, womanist theology. And then there was a nascent environmental theology in the 70s too. So we had a tremendous variety of theologies. 4 years ago, Gustavo Gutierrez was here at Vanderbilt, and I asked him to lecture in my constructive theology class. And he said in that lecture what I'd heard him say many times before. He said, liberation theology may be at an end, but our concern with poverty will never end. So for me, it's the basic issues that these theologies raised, poverty and the poor, racism, gender questions, environmental questions, are the lasting questions. And they're not going to go away, because if we don't solve these problems, if we don't solve inequality in income and wealth, we're not going to have much of a future on this planet. And if we don't learn how to live in our home, which is nature, we're not going to have a future. So those are the changes that for me have lasted and that we have to continue to work with in theology.
What projects, books, or anything you want to tell us about do you have planned to begin your retirement?
Well, the first book on my desk is the one I've been working on a long time. It's a study for the church about how the church can exist in the global market economy. If the being of the church is God's gift of Jesus Christ, that means God's grace, then how can the church exist in a society that has become a commodity society? That means a market society. That means everything is for sale. So the first question the church has to ask, is there anything not for sale? And if it can't answer that question well, then it has no space and time in which to exist. So I'm working on a number of questions in that book. One of them is debt. I think that's the issue that is most pressing in our global economy. Debt is ruining the lives of millions and millions of people. And what does it mean that Christians pray, forgive us our debt as we forgive our debtors? So I'm trying to mine the scriptures, if you will, and the church tradition to find out what answers have been given to that and what answers about debt we can suggest to the public sphere today. It's not an easy answer at all because since John Locke's two treatises in 1690, we've thought about God and economy in completely different ways. And we more or less in modernity have said, let the market decide about debt. But the old question of usury, for example, raised in the Torah and radicalized by Jesus, who said, lend without expectation of return, and radicalized in the Fathers, and brought to a wonderful fruition in the scholastic theologians who had the patience to answer the question, what is usury and what is valid interest? And they went back to the Hebrew understanding of usury. The Hebrew word for usury is nesek, which means to bite or to devour. So I think the church's witness to the world on the question of debt and so many other questions about economy are absolutely crucial. And these other issues I mentioned a while ago, racism, sexism, gender, environment, are all part and parcel of this question of the economy that serves life rather than death. The next book that I've started is a Christological book focused on the Theology Crucis, on the theology of the cross. And it's an attempt to relate cross and resurrection to the Torah, which is what Jesus himself preaches. He doesn't preach anything other than what is in the Torah and the basic theological understanding behind the Torah. And then the third project is a little bit like that of one of my predecessors, Ed Farley, who in the last half of his career became deeply interested in theological education. And the last 2 or 3 years, that's been a deep interest of mine too, asking the questions about how we can survive, how we have a future given this business plan problem and our basic identity, asking what we exist for. That's a very tough question that eventually erases all these other things I've been talking about. I'm hopeful, but I think it's going to mean some radical changes in the church and some radical changes in theological education. Theological education began at Andover Newton and Harvard and Yale um, in order to train what they call divines. That's the reason they call it divinity school. So it was not just giving people knowledge, it was giving them hope and courage to do ministry, I think, in the world. Um, we've lost that to some extent, and how do we regain that? But the driving question for me is what is theological about theological education? So that may be the basic issue we need to focus on. I'm hoping that faculties across the country can begin to think about that question. We tend, my experience over these nearly 50 years is that when faculty get together, we talk about ourselves, not much about our students, or not all that much about the church and the world. But the reason a faculty exists is to have this rich diversity of approaches and fields and in perspectives to bring to bear on the crises that we're facing. So I think if faculty could have a sense of where we are in history, faculties might begin to focus on what really counts. Thank you. You're welcome.